If this is your first time tuning in, welcome. You're catching us mid-series, so I recommend starting from episode 1 to get the full experience. Like with most disasters, the immediate devastation after a wildfire is what gets the most attention. Loss of life, the homes to be rebuilt, the cause of it in the first place. But disasters have a long tail, and sometimes bring along other crises.
We had 12 flash floods, and people were just, throwing up their hands. It's like, when is this going to stop?
This is Jim Boyd. He and his wife Annie live outside of Glen Haven, Colorado, in a rural mountain community called The Retreat. They narrowly avoided losing their home to the Cameron Peak fire in 2020. But the following summer, when the rain came, it threw their recovering neighborhood into chaos again.
The stream, which is the Miller Fork, sounded so loud. It's like, that's not normal. That's too loud. And I told Jim, and we hightailed it down there, and it had topped over. I mean, it was a flood, and it was a mess.
Rainwater can rush down the steep terrain when there is no vegetation slowing it down, causing mudslides.
It can just be a wall of water. We actually had a resident who was cutting dead trees down by the stream who got hit by a wave and lost his chainsaw, but got himself out of the stream before it swept him away. And then 2 floods later, he found his chainsaw downstream. It had been washed back up on shore or something. But it's built a lot of respect for the power of water.
The wildfires that ravaged Colorado in 2020 have had a major impact on our watersheds, from floods and mudslides to the damage to the vegetation, soils, and organisms that act as nature's water filter. Now, almost 4 years later, many of the forests and hillsides are still so severely charred that little to no regrowth has taken place. In this episode, we'll dive into the relationship between fire and water, that critical resource that feeds our taps every day. This is United by Fire, a podcast exploring hard truths about our landscapes and ourselves. I'm your host, Kristan Uhlenbrock. Jim's the kind of person who likes to keep busy. He recently retired from a decades-long career at the YMCA of the Rockies. But he still volunteers as a driver for the Estes Park seasonal trolley. And he built Annie a greenhouse to grow flowers year-round. He also takes a hands-on role in his community through the local homeowners association.
I maintain the roads, or at least try to maintain the roads in the retreat. We have 12 miles of road, 24 lane miles, and it's been impacted a lot with the fires and subsequent floods.
Since Cameron Peak, Jim has been locked in a constant battle with water. And it's not just any kind of water.
Every time it would flash flood, it looked like crude oil coming down and carrying all of this debris.
This black water is filled with ash, contaminants, and other material from the singed landscape.
Lots and lots of tree limbs and things. And the debris dams that were created would be 10, 12 feet tall. And then those would break loose, and all of that debris would go down and wash out driveways and roads again.
To keep the roads passable, he's hauled in truckload after truckload of rocks and concrete blocks, and hauled out pile after pile of debris in order to help his neighbors maintain access to their homes.
And we felt for those people because some of them would hire a contractor and come in. They'd spend thousands of dollars getting a new culvert put in and new rock and getting it all fixed up, and then we'd have another flash flood.
This past spring, I visited Jim's home up in the mountains to get a better sense of the conditions on the ground. Driving up the long, winding gravel roads, I passed piles of rubble and construction equipment. In every direction, I could see stands of blackened trees.
Yeah, they dive bomb.
Yeah.
Hummingbirds dive bombing us.
And then,
So what's behind your property over here? What are we looking at?
This is all forest going up the ridge behind us. Our property, you can see some orange or pink flagging up there. All of those trees I've cut down, and now I'm limbing them and creating some burn piles that I'll burn next winter when there's snow on the ground. But on beyond that, that's all national forest with lots of dead trees. Probably 80% of the trees were burned and blackened and killed.
The National Weather Service offers simple advice about post-fire flooding. If you can look uphill from where you are and see a burnt-out area, you are at risk. Jim and Annie don't live next to a creek. Their home is tucked into a hillside, which offers some protection, but doesn't eliminate the risk of debris tumbling down onto their home. Jim's eager to show me the challenges his neighbors are dealing with and the work he's doing to keep the roads clear. So we jump into his truck and head out. Nice truck.
Thanks. It's my retirement present. Annie got a greenhouse, I got a new truck.
We head down to a stream that feeds into the Big Thompson River, a tributary of the South Platte. We pause at one of the water crossings. Some have culverts, and some are just raised concrete sections designed to have water run over them during high flow periods. This crossing is critical for residents to be able to get to and from their homes.
The one flood that we had last year still was 6 feet high over the top of this crossing here. There were 2 great big cottonwood trees, and it completely washed one of them out that's now sitting in the stream channel. And the concrete blocks that we put along the border of the road to help stabilize it, some of those eroded and have slid down the embankments.
This crossing's been flooded out at least half a dozen times. In the first year after the fire, Jim left a backhoe sitting nearby for good measure.
I just left it parked down here because it would overtop the road anywhere from 1 foot to 4 or 5 feet, and it would leave behind a lot of sediment and debris, trees and everything hung up on the road. And so we would spend hours getting it cleared back off and back to being passable again.
We continue driving down the road and stop to check out a different part of the stream. Its walls have been gouged to expose layers of soil and rock, and there's not much vegetation around.
Just for perspective, that used to be just a little bubbling brook down there, but since the floods, it has widened that drainage, probably by 30 or 40 feet across now, whereas it used to just be like 2 or 3 feet across. And it's carrying a lot more water now, especially this time of year compared to what it used to.
When fire burns through, it can weaken the soil and coat the environment in ash. Then the land loses its ability to absorb and direct water. That sets the stage for erosion, especially during heavy rain events. The hotter and slower a fire burns, the greater its impact on the soil. It can become so water resistant that it hardens like pavement. This problem is so bad in the retreat that some of Jim's neighbors have installed flood barrier bags. And I'm not talking about those small sandbags. These things are massive.
It's basically 4 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot. It's a type of canvas material that's inside wire mesh. And then you fill them with sand or some kind of natural material. And then you tie multiple flood barrier bags in a row together. They're wired together to create almost like a dam, a wall, and they put those strategically around homes that are vulnerable.
Jim steers us past a house level with the stream. These fence-like barriers wrap around part of the property. They're scoured and streaked with mud.
They had water that went in that side window there. It was high enough, probably 5 feet up on the side of their house, and it actually blew out that window before they got the flood barrier bags put up on 3 sides of their house now. And these people have a great attitude. You can see some of their signs that they put out on the flood barrier bags. One that says, "Welcome to the Ark." They've got some good humor. Beach in a box and beachfront property.
Water can pose just as great of a risk as fire. In the summer of 2021, a rainstorm caused a flash flood that killed a family of 4, vacationing in a cabin near the Cameron Peak burn scar. Yet you don't have to live in or visit these charred landscapes to feel the impact. Colorado is known as a headwater state because our water supports 18 other states and Mexico. One of the primary sources of this water comes in the form of the snow that falls on our mountains and then melts. It then flows through our landscapes in a network of waterways, reservoirs, and tunnels. That's why what happens upstream matters to us all.
Most people don't know. If you talk to folks in Fort Collins, I've talked to my neighbors in Fort Collins, and they don't understand that this is water that traveled all the way from the headwaters of the Colorado River, and that fire that burnt over there that they heard about directly burnt the watersheds that their water at the tap comes from.
This is Esther Vincent. She works for Northern Water and has for the past 25 years, tackling both water quality and quantity issues through data collection, conservation, and efficiency programs.
I'm the Environmental Services Director at Northern Water, and I have been working on the East Troublesome post-fire watershed restoration in an executive sponsor capacity on behalf of my organization.
For Esther, like many, the summer of 2020 was hard. She had colleagues who lost their homes in the East Troublesome fire.
It felt very personal, even though my house hadn't burnt in the fire.
And she witnessed just how devastating more than 400,000 acres of burned landscape can be.
These were watersheds that we had worked in, for some of us for a couple of decades. Like in my case, it's not like we didn't know that there would be fires in our watersheds, but nobody envisioned that scale. And 2 fires at the same time within our area, affecting, the 2 primary water supplies of some of the communities that we serve. And we certainly didn't have a roadmap to recovery for anything of that scale.
The East Troublesome and Cameron Peak fires impacted more than half of Northern Water's supply. But East Troublesome was particularly troublesome for Northern Water because of its impact on a major water initiative, the Colorado Big Thompson Project. This massive project, jointly operated and funded by Northern Water and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, moves water from the western side of the Continental Divide to the east through a process known as Trans-Mountain Diversion. It starts in Grand County at the headwaters of the Colorado River and channels water to Colorado's Front Range via the Big Thompson River, ultimately reaching the South Platte. This water supports over 1 million people, sustains agriculture on the eastern plains, and powers 6 hydroelectric plants. So when fires ripped through the area, Esther had a long list of concerns. Things like flash floods tearing up natural and built infrastructure, or sediment, ash, and debris-filled runoff threatening water quality.
So there's the shock of the event there, and then there's, okay, well, what are we supposed to do about this? What do we need to do about this? From a water provider's perspective, we don't own any land. We are downstream of these lands that burn, but we have no jurisdiction over the land that burn.
Northern Water was in a difficult position. First, they needed to work across a massive patchwork of public and private lands and with the community. Second, they had never tackled a recovery effort of this scale before. But they knew they had to do something. At the same time, the federal government was offering funding and support for the recovery, and they needed some local partners that had the capacity to lead efforts in Colorado. Northern Water had to decide whether to step into that role.
It meant that we were going to have to work directly with landowners in Grand County in the burn scar. We're a Trans Mountain diverter. That doesn't make us the most popular kid on the block on the West Slope. We have collaborative and very strong relationship with partners on that side, but nonetheless, we do remove water from these watersheds, and that's been going on for decades, and the local community is not necessarily all gung-ho about that.
Ultimately, Northern Water stepped up to partner with Grand County and other organizations.
At the same time, we felt like it was very important to unite forces with Grand County and the other players that we engaged in the fire recovery after the East Troublesome, because we all depend on these watersheds, and we wanted to be present for the community. We wanted to walk the talk in the sense that we don't just take water out of these watersheds. We also protect them and take care of the health of these systems. And we're all on the same boat, and we're going to figure this out together.
If you do things to people, they almost always resent it. Doing things for people sometimes has good intentions, but if it's not what they want, it generally doesn't work. But if you do things with people and you get their input, or at least not an objection, then it usually works. So that's a 2-4-with lesson.
This is Grand County Commissioner Merritt Linke. When the East Troublesome fire tore through the area, Merritt was on the front lines supporting his community and working with Northern Water and all the partners to repair the landscape. He has deep ties to the area. His family has been part of the local ranching and agricultural community for generations. And in 2012, he decided to venture into the political arena. Why did you run for county commission all these years ago?
I'm tall and I hit my head a lot is the only thing I can say. Just kidding. Anyway, no, I think it was probably more along the lines of practicing what I preach. And that is the lesson that I think I tried to make to our kids. I'd always say, well, if you don't like the way things are going, you should stand up and do something about it.
His district is a rural mountain community that averages 8 people per square mile and includes the towns of Granby and Grand Lake. He has a clever way of articulating what he sees as the biggest issues for his constituents.
I kind of jokingly say it, but it's actually quite serious, is the West Slope W's that we deal with. Water, wildfires, and wolves.
For anyone who follows Colorado's headlines, water, wildfire, and wolves frequently dominate our news. These are often framed as conflicts between rural and urban interests, partly because there are real disagreements and debates about whose priorities get represented on these topics. Yet at the same time, there are many who are trying to find some common ground on these complicated issues.
How do you talk about the value of water?
Are you buying or selling? It's incredibly valuable in terms of that it's an essential component for the food that we eat.
Merritt had been a high school science teacher, but a couple of decades ago, he got back into the family business. He does everything from growing hay to being a feed dealer to leasing land to run cattle.
I'm kind of the concierge of the cattle. Ranchers, sometimes they get bad press, but ranchers have to be good stewards of the land because if they weren't, they'd be out of business.
With all these different hats, Merritt cares deeply about how we manage our landscapes and resources, both before and after a fire. At the end of May, Merritt and I paid a visit to some land he leases for grazing. We parked near a fence, looking across a field that was turning green, but ringed with dead trees up on the hillsides.
So the fire basically moved from the west to the east. This pasture basically is perpendicular to that line of path of the fire.
Merritt grazed cattle in this spot during the summer of 2020, and he says it's an important part of the East Troublesome fire behavior story.
Fire requires three things, right? Temperature and fuel and oxygen. The fuel on this pasture was removed because the cattle ate it. So it did not burn anywhere across this pasture. It burned around it on the north side, and as you can see, it burned that line of trees and jumped into that meadow that we were just looking at and actually crossed the road. I think that's important that cattle are an effective fuel management tool, and I think that's a lesson sort of learned, hopefully learned, by some of the federal managers that can be an effective tool to remove fuel.
The use of grazing, whether by cattle, goats, or sheep, as a wildfire mitigation tool is still an open research question. Merritt's experience is an example of a real-world experiment and points to the need to look at all options that might prevent fires from wreaking such havoc. As we look out across the wide green meadow that didn't burn, Merritt points out that for the past decade, he's been transitioning it back to native grasses. He's constantly thinking about the interconnection of our soil and water system and what it means to be a good steward of the land.
Healthy soil is going to have a lot of organic material between the clumps of grass, and then it would absorb moisture and keep the sun from drying it out. If you're a good ranch manager, which we all strive to be, you're going to move those cattle around and not overgraze or hit any part too hard so that you always leave some, because the last thing you want is any bare ground ever showing.
Pastures and ranch lands encompass a large portion of our landscapes, and we're still learning how to manage them well. Healthy soils influence everything from our wildfire risk to the water we drink.
Grand County is the headwaters of the headwaters. It's the headwaters of the Colorado, and it's actually the furthest east of any West Slope county. We are basically one 13-mile tunnel and one 6-mile tunnel away from the East Slope.
These landscapes may not be in everyone's backyards, but maybe we should all think of them that way.
A healthy forest, a healthy watershed means better water that goes to households in the Front Range in Denver. It comes right down to dollars too. If they can filter it less because it's cleaner as it goes through that tunnel, that saves the end user some money too. Everything is connected to everything.
After the fires, one of the first challenges was getting eyes on the ground to assess the damage.
Typically, the agencies that enter the post-fire recovery, they'll fly the fire to get some images of the burn scar and make an assessment of the severity of the burn.
This is Esther Vincent from Northern Water.
Well, we had snow on the ground, so that made it really difficult to do the assessments and prepare as soon as we could for what we knew was going to come early July the following year, which are the monsoonal rains.
About 90% of the East Troublesome burn scar is on public land. So that meant Northern Water was working with a slew of federal and state agencies, as well as community partners, to map out the burn severity, secure funding, and start implementing projects.
You get engineers involved, and then they start designing mitigation projects. And it can be what they call flood walls. It can be sandbags that you pile up. It could be berms. You have a lot of erosion that's going to happen in a certain area, and you have a house close to the banks, and that house might collapse into the stream if you don't provide protection on the banks. And so you're going to go put in a bunch of riprap and big rocks and harden the stream beds so that it's protected against the volume of water that's coming down and the erosive forces. And the idea is to keep the soil on the hill slope for future revegetation and also for protection of downstream interests and values.
One of the primary ways to support plant growth and prevent erosion in a post-fire landscape is aerial mulching.
These are helicopter operations. We had over 19,000 helicopter drops, and we mulched about 12,000 acres of the burn scar.
It costs about $2,500 to mulch 1 acre. So Northern Water had to be strategic on where it would drop the wood chips, not to mention all the other restoration efforts.
We've spent so far about $50 million on the burn scar on East Troublesome. That's just East Troublesome. There's about the same amount of money that's been spent on Cameron Peak. And there is so much more work that needs to be done.
She estimates that the total cost of post-fire watershed recovery for both mega fires plus the Miller Fork fire was more than $200 million. Yet, even with that price tag, Northern Water hasn't had to raise rates for consumers.
We've been the victim of our own success because we were very successful in leveraging and obtaining federal funding or state funding to do the work, which really buffered the cost of doing the work on the water users on really the east side of our continental divide here in this case.
Esther says that the goal for a water utility used to be staying out of the spotlight.
Most people don't think about it. They turn on the faucet, water comes out, and we talk often in the water community about how good we were for so long as utilities about being invisible. If you were talked about, it's because there was a problem, and we can't operate this way anymore. We have to help our water users understand what it takes to bring that water to their tap, what's involved in terms of infrastructure, what's involved in terms of the sources of that water and what influences these sources.
As wildfires become more frequent and severe, putting valuable resources at risk, the cost for all this recovery is increasing. So who foots the bill? To get some perspective, I spoke with Tony Chang, the director of the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute at Colorado State University, who thinks a lot about our policies and approaches to land management.
Right now, the costs are borne by taxpayers.
These are known as externalities. So when you plant a tree or clean up after a wildfire, it's difficult to capture those costs and benefits and charge any one entity.
These are not values that are accounted for by a market.
Which is why it's often governments, through taxpayers, who pay for these things. Yet we know resources are limited. And wildfires don't just affect the places they burn, but the people and cities and commerce downstream who depend on clean water. So new funding models are being explored to try to incorporate the value of a healthy forest.
I think there is a lot of interest in maybe more market-based approaches, especially before a fire happens. Can we generate investments from downstream beneficiaries to fund upstream wildfire and risk mitigation practices? Those have been tried out in a lot of other parts of the world. China has done quite a bit of that to try to reforest a lot of their uplands that have been really devastated by historic deforestation and agricultural practices. We have yet to really find that here in the US. I think there's been a lot of experimentation. I think one of the more promising partnerships that we've seen pioneered is right here in Colorado between Denver Water and the US Forest Service, called the Forest to Faucet Partnership, where Denver Water and the US Forest kind of split the cost of doing forest fire mitigation.
This partnership between a local water utility and large federal land manager has been in place since 2010. They've been identifying strategic areas where mitigation work, like forest thinning and prescribed burns, might help prevent a catastrophic wildfire that could impact Denver's water supplies. Tony says examples like this can help us rethink how to fund these projects.
Right now, we're pretty much in reactive mode, and reactive mode is always going to be much more expensive in the long run than proactive mode. We know that when you have intact forests, that it can provide a nature-based solution for all kinds of our challenges. It can mitigate climate change by taking in carbon and storing it. It can improve our watershed functioning and help watersheds retain and slowly filter water rather than having it come all at once. And so I am biased that we should be making investments in forests, keeping forests as forests in a lot of these burned areas. But we just don't have right now a lot of momentum and attention span and resources around that.
So I asked Tony, how would he make the case to water consumers?
So when you turn on your water, where does your water come from? It comes from the high forested mountains of Colorado. And if you want your water to be clean and secure and affordable, we want to keep those forested landscapes intact and healthy and able to recover from fire. And we have the solutions to be able to do that. But we need your support in terms of just being an aware and active citizen. We need you to understand that if your rate increases, to pay for some forest mitigation, that you understand why and where that money is going. And if there's opportunities to signal understanding and support to our land managers like the US Forest Service or other agencies that are doing this forest work, send that support.
This watershed's been kind of ground zero of the East Troublesome fire. There is a highway, Highway 125, that runs along Willow Creek itself for a good part of the watershed.
I'm standing on a gated bridge overlooking the Willow Creek Reservoir, a storage facility for water located in Grand County and part of the Colorado Big Thompson Project. It sits nestled among mountains and forest and designed to capture snowmelt.
Gotta love the wind on a reservoir.
I'm here with Esther. We're both hugging ourselves because of the cold. The water's surface ripples in the wind.
The watershed upstream of the reservoir is 90% burned. And before it was burned, it was 90% affected by the pine beetle kill. So it's very likely that one of the reasons it burned so badly and intensely is because there was a lot of dead standing trees.
Seeing large stands of dead trees from a pine beetle epidemic or other pest infestation is not uncommon across Colorado and the West. These are just matchsticks waiting to burn. And if that happens, all the woody material can wash down the hillside into critical water resources.
The debris boom, which is these yellow buoys that are kind of attached in a line, they are anchored on each at each end of the boom, and they're intended to trap any debris that enters the reservoir. And because we have two, the one on the upstream end tends to catch more of the debris than this one downstream. This one is just
intended to protect this particular piece of infrastructure that we're standing on top of. And so it's the canal that takes the water to Granby Reservoir.
Once this water gets to Granby Reservoir, it then flows through a 13-mile pipe across the Continental Divide and down into the towns and cities of the Front Range, the farmlands to the east, and ultimately the Gulf of Mexico. Some of the water from the reservoir also flows into the Colorado River, heading southwest. So it's a critical upstream body of water to maintain.
We have collected a lot of debris, and the debris then get removed with heavy equipment. We kind of like scoop them out of the water and then pile them up. You can see there's kind of a leftover of a little bit of a debris pile there, and then they get hauled away.
Following the creek downstream from the reservoir, Esther takes me to visit a sediment trap, another tool to help clean up the aftermath. We walk out across a raised bed of rock in the middle of a stream.
To the right, you have Stillwater Creek, which without the impoundments would be just flowing as a fairly narrow channel into Granby Reservoir. And what we have now is a berm, which is made of riprap and dirt. It's slowing the water down on its way to Granby Reservoir.
The berm acts as a road detour, causing the stream to slow down as it makes turns to go around it.
So by trapping the sediment here and then removing the sediment, dredging it and hauling it away, we're preventing that nutrient load from entering the system.
These post-fire sediments can contain heavy metals and toxins, as well as increased levels of nutrients, like nitrogen and phosphorus.
There are lots of symptoms that manifest themselves in water bodies when nutrients become too rich and concentrated. We're talking about blue-green algae blooms, which are also known as hazardous algae blooms, and they are associated with the production of toxins that are problematic for contact recreation as well as for drinking water.
Once that mixture gets to water treatment facilities, it's more difficult and expensive to treat.
We've hauled, I think it's hundreds of truckloads of sediment out of this particular site.
This berm isn't permanent, but likely to be here for at least 10 years. And while there are some signs that things are improving, watershed recovery doesn't happen overnight.
We are so far from being done. Our programs and our frameworks are not set up right now to be responsive of these events at the scale at which they're occurring and at the level of the need.
In the aftermath of 2020, everywhere I turn, people are saying that we need a better plan, a new path forward, a reimagining of how we spend our dollars, that how we've been operating doesn't work for the situation we're in now. A wildfire crisis that has ripple effects far and wide.
We don't have decades to plan for this and then get to implementation 30 years from now. We've got to move to actions on the ground much, much faster than that. And the question is how we make it happen. How do we overcome the policy and institutional barriers, which to me seem to be the biggest ones right now?
Lots of promising collaborations and conversations are happening. But Esther says that both Colorado and the country need comprehensive forest health plans.
The big roadmap that provides a compass for everybody to follow, that is essential. Otherwise, it's like a beehive without a queen. You know, it gets very disorganized. And if you've ever observed a beehive without its queen, the bees become very disoriented. They start taking on jobs that were not theirs initially and do really bizarre things. And eventually the colony will collapse, you know. And so you have to have the queen there. You have to have that central organizer and directional piece. And we don't have that just yet.
This is United by Fire. Up next, we explore why our values around land management come into conflict, what it means to create a resilient ecosystem, and how to live with fire.
It is part of the ecosystem to burn. It wants fire. It's just a matter of balance.
Laws of Notion is a production of the Institute for Science and Policy at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. To learn more, visit lawsofnotion.org. I'm your host, Kristan Uhlenbrock. This episode was produced by me, Carson Frame, and Tricia Waddell, with support from Nicole Delaney and fact-checking by Kate Long. Sound design by Seth Samuel. Original music by Ryan Flores, and additional tracks by Epidemic Sounds. For a full list of credits, check out the show notes. If you've enjoyed listening, please rate and review this podcast and consider supporting the Institute. Learn more about us at institute.dmns.org. Thanks for listening.